Cool. Well, welcome to church. Here's the second Asian who will be speaking to you. Welcome to our second installments of the series Questions About God. A couple of weeks ago, we put a blackboard in the auditorium asking you, could you please give us some questions that you have, but not just questions that you have, many of the questions that people ask you. So if you're the Christian, what are the questions that people ask you? Because we want to talk about not just the things that concern us, but the things that concern people outside of church. So one of the topics that surfaced a lot was how does it work with faith and science? Does science contradict faith and vice versa? Or how can they work together? So when we were putting together this message series, we thought we have to talk about this. So here we are. And if you're not used to coming to church, if you usually don't come to church, we hope you feel welcome. We hope you feel accepted and welcome. And this is a very special Sunday because I think this is the only Sunday in the year where you'll hear more quotes from scientists and research than from the Bible. So that's a special Sunday. I'm not a scientist myself, but I did grow up in a house of one. So my dad is a molecular biologist. So he looks at life in the really smallest form possible. He looks at genomes. So that's a set of chromosomes. And he's a Christian as well. So I grew up in a house where these two things didn't seem to contradict each other. And I grew up in a world where my dad was constantly busy doing research and teaching about stuff. But on Sunday, he went to church, and every morning he read the Bible. And I remember when I was, I think around 13 or 14 years old, he was wanting to practice one of his classes on me about DNA, RNA, and I thought, okay, man, I'm going to quit biology as soon as I can. So I dropped it as soon as I could, and I continued to study in mathematics and finance. So I did study, but I'm not a scientist. And I think this is still a relevant debate, right? At least it's a relevant topic to talk about. I don't know how many of you have talked about this topic maybe in the last couple of months. But in a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the NRC, which is a Dutch newspaper, that says, I'll translate, God exists, there is proof. I didn't think the proof was that strong. I didn't think it was a really good proof. It wasn't that solid. But at least it shows that it's still a relevant topic of discussion. That even a newspaper discusses it, a national newspaper discusses it. And for those of you who've lived here for a couple of years, I think this discussion surfaces every once in a while, just like another discussion that usually surfaces around this time of year. Sinterklaas is coming, so get ready. And I know I cannot answer all of your questions, all of the questions around this topic in half an hour, so I'm not going to try and do that. That would be an actual miracle from God if that would happen. But I hope that you can at least follow the line of thinking. Because I'm not trying to prove you wrong here, I'm just trying to say that I think science and faith do go together. And I think that somewhere in your framework of thinking, that there might be room for God. So we're going to go into three different statements or topics, and we'll discuss them all a little bit. And the first one is this. Science and faith do not go together. We can keep it on the screen. Science and faith do not go together. Probably you've all heard this statement. Maybe this is even your opinion. And if it's your opinion, that's fine. You're still welcome. And I think it's lovely to have that conversation. I think if you look at this statement, this would be sort of the accepted worldview in our current society. If you would look at things that were naturally written about in the media, I think it's more from this standpoint than from the standpoint of science and faith are complementary. I think if you talk around with the people that you know, maybe your friends and colleagues, I think this is a question that people have, is that they don't see how science and faith can work together. And if you don't see how, I think the usual conclusion that people have or make is that they don't. So I think the sort of accepted general opinion in our current society is that science and faith don't go together. I think it's really hard to prove people wrong on this, or prove someone right on this. I don't think I can do that, at least. But what I can do is take you in a course of thinking. And I think the first one is if society or most people don't think that science and faith can go together, it would be interesting to know what scientists think. If scientists think that faith and science go together. I think if we talk to people of religion, that would be interesting as well as people of different faiths. But for now, we'll look at what different scientists think. And in 2015, a study was done by Rice University, and they surveyed almost 10,000 researchers from the US, the UK, Hong Kong, India, France, Taiwan, Turkey, and Italy. So that's a really broad sample size. That's a big sample size. As a mathematician, I can affirm the sample size is big enough to actually draw some conclusions. And also the sample is quite wide. So there are researchers from countries that are generally religious, and there are researchers from countries that are generally atheistic. And there were also 600 in-depth interviews to make sure that it's not just the numbers talking, but there's actually some qualitative support as well. And that research, that survey that showed that 25% of researchers, 25% of scientists that were surveyed believe that science and religion don't go together. So 25% says science and religion, they're in conflict. And then there's another 25% of scientists who say science and faith, science and religion, they're actually complementary. They help each other, they support each other. And there were 50% that says they're independent. So science and faith, they have value, but different fields, they're independent. Which is quite interesting, right? So when we look at this statement and accept it as some sort of truth that is accepted in our society, it's actually not the same opinion that most scientists have, which is, to me, quite interesting. If scientists say that these could actually complement, or at least they're independent, but at least most scientists say they're not in conflict, what is the reason that we would say that they're in conflict? What is the reason that we would believe that science and faith could not work together? Something else that's quite interesting is that if science and faith would not go together, then there's sort of, this might sound a little bit arrogant, but why are there so many successful Christian scientists? If you look at all the Nobel laureates, so Nobel prizes that were given in the previous century, so the 20th century, then around 73% of all Nobel prizes in chemistry were won by Christian scientists, 65% in physics were won by Christian scientists, and 62% in medicine, which is quite a lot. And I know that sample is a bit skewed, because most Nobel Prize winners have come from Europe or the US, but still it shows that, at the very least, what it shows is that your Christianity does not stop you from being a good scientist, or at least it should not stop you. This is something that King Solomon wrote in his book Proverbs 18 verse 15. He says, "The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out." So what this means is that as a Christian, the Bible actually encourages us to seek out knowledge. The Bible actually encourages to do our research, to look at the facts, to become smarter, to become more knowledgeable, which is really interesting. I think the general worldview of a Christian is at least not the person who should seek everything out, if you look beyond the church walls. But I think the Bible teaches otherwise, and some of these facts also support otherwise. John Polkinghorne, right? I expected that, blank faces. No one knows John Polkinghorne. I didn't know him either, so that's fine. John Polkinghorne was a professor in physics, and in 1979 he abandoned his position at Cambridge to become an Anglican priest. And he wrote a book about this topic, about how science and faith are at least perceived in the scientific world. And he wrote a taxonomy, so that means he categorized the positions, the sort of faith positions that different scientists have. And he said that, we're all in the search of knowledge, and as a Christian, you should accept knowledge, whether it's from the Bible or from a different source. If you truly believe that God made the universe, if you truly believe God made the earth, if we investigate the earth and truth comes out of it, that's something to accept. So we're all in a common search for truth. That's basically what he says. And then how he categorizes these faith positions of different scientists is that he says faith and science are either in conflict. And a good example of that is Richard Dawkins. If you ever looked up some online YouTube videos of faith versus science debates, he's probably one that comes up. He's avidly against any sort of religion in general, but definitely in the field of science. Another view is one of independence. So faith and science, they work independently of each other. Galileo is an example, Darwin was an example, but Stephen Jay Gould, I referred to him a couple of times. He was a paleontologist. If you've never heard of that word, that's fine. He looks into fossils and DNA evidence, looking at evolution. He's an atheist, but he believes that faith and science should work independently. And then there's the view that science and faith can actually work together, either in dialogue. Maria Mitchell, which was the first female astronomer, or at least well-known female astronomer, she believes that faith and science are in dialogue. And Einstein is a really, probably most well-known example of someone who says, no, they're not just in dialogue, they're not just connected, they're integrated. I can't see my research as separate from what I believe. Actually, everything that I see out of my research leads me to know more of what I believe. He wasn't a Christian, but he did say that his science and his belief are really integrated. So Stephen Jay Gould was that evolutionary biologist. He says this, so he believed that science and faith are independent. He says this: the net or magisterium, all big words, but that basically says the areas of science covers the empirical realm. What is the universe made of? So what is the fact? And how does it work this way? And why does it work this way? Which is the theory. The magisterium of religion, so the area of religion, extends over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. These two do not overlap. So this is an atheist saying, okay, science and faith, they might not work together, but at least they're independent. And he's even saying that this area of religion, it answers questions, a different question than science answers, namely one of ultimate meaning and moral value. He sees the value of religion, the value of our faith in moral value and ultimate meaning. And then Francis Collins, which is another scientist, he's the head of the National Institute of Health in the US today. He discovered the genome, here's that word again, so the set of chromosomes that predicts certain hereditary diseases, such as Huntington's. So this is someone who really made an effort, really made a contribution to healthcare. And he's a Christian. He says that I found that there's a wonderful harmony in the complementary truths of science and faith. The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. God can be found in the cathedral and in the laboratory. By investigating God's majestic and awesome creation, science can actually be a means of worship, which is, if the Bible really tells us as Christians to do good work, that we can actually worship God with what we do, not just by singing songs on a Sunday, but actually do our jobs well, serving the people around us well. That means we also worship God if we do our research well. So if you're a scientist, if you do your job well, that's a reason for worship. That's actually a means of worship. My dad, who is a scientist, said it to me. We were having dinner last week, and he told me it's amazing to see what you believe in the big picture, to see that confirmed on the smallest level. So what he believes in terms of God, creating the universe, creating all of us, seeing that affirmed in all of his research on DNA, genetic level. So I'm not trying to, what I'm not trying to do is tell you that everything you've been thinking is wrong. I'm just trying to see if there's a little bit of space in what you're currently believing or where you're currently assuming to be true for God. Because I think that some of us have done our research, some of us have read a lot, looked up a lot of things online, or maybe read a lot of books, but I believe that there's space for God in the things that we currently believe. Cool, so that's statement one. Thanks for keeping it up. The second statement is one that, I don't put it up yet, and I think it's one that, if you talk about science and faith, I think the second one is a topic that always is a topic of discussion, and that's the topic of evolution. So the second statement that I want to discuss is evolution has been proven, therefore I cannot believe in God. Evolution has been proven, therefore I cannot believe in God. So I'm not going to try and reconcile these two completely, because there's a reason why this is a topic for discussion, right? Have you ever had a discussion with someone else about evolution? Yeah, I see a lot of hands. Me too. I think there's a reason why this is a topic of discussion, right? I think before we go further, what I want to do is first discuss the first part, evolution has been proven, and then the second part, therefore I don't believe in God. Evolution is a hypothesis that was proposed by someone whose name is Charles Darwin. I think most of us are familiar with that name. And he himself already saw a couple of problems with the theory that he posed. And Stephen Jay Gould, who I just referred to, he's a paleontologist, so he looked into evolution a lot himself. And he says this: the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. So I think if you look at the world around us, evolutionary theory is widely accepted because there is certain evidence for it. But the way that it's presented in our school books, when you talk about it with even paleontologists, even atheist paleontologists, they would say that there is a serious amount of data that is missing to actually be able to prove this hypothesis, which is a statement that comes into play if you say evolution has been proven, therefore I don't believe in God. There's actually a lot of assumptions that we have to make. There's a lot of things that we don't know. There's a lot of things that we can't prove. A scientific fact is, or an empiric fact in science is something that you can replicate, is an experiment that you can do again. And I think the biggest problem in evolutionary theory is that it's not something we can reproduce, it's not something we can replicate. And this is not the opinion of me, one of the pastors in this church. This is something that even non-Christian, even atheist researchers state, which is, I think, something we should know if we come into this debate, and something you should know if you exclude the existence of God on the basis of this statement. I think this is important to know, that it actually requires some level of faith, or at least big assumptions, to assume this as well. But this is not the biggest objection to faith that Darwin saw himself. Darwin himself pointed out the logical argument as being the biggest problem with evolution through means of natural selection, which basically means evolution through means of natural selection basically means no God came into play. There was no higher being who created the earth or who created people or created other beings. There are other forms or other theories of evolution that do include an intelligent higher being, but the theory that Darwin posed, or at least the hypothesis that Darwin posed, was one of natural selection. And he says that this is the biggest problem, the logical argument, mainly that evolution through natural selection means that it's driven by survival and procreation. So those are the biggest drivers behind evolution through natural selection. And he himself pointed out that if that is the case, if the big drivers are procreation and survival, how can we even trust the fact that we think logically? How can we even trust the fact that this is Darwin speaking himself? How can I even trust the fact that the theory that I presented makes any sense or can be trusted at all? If my creation itself is driven by survival and procreation, then thinking logically is not one of the main outcomes or the necessary outcomes. Thinking and searching for truth is not one of the main outcomes of evolution through natural selection. And I think that resonates to some degree with all of us, because most of us are, at least to some degree, I think, in search for truth, right? I don't think you have to believe in God to be able to know the feeling that you're in search for truth, and I think we're all in a common quest for truth. So I think that's the two main arguments that, so I repeat, not me, but Darwin himself and other scientists make with regards to evolution. And then there's another step saying, if I believe in evolution, I cannot believe in God. I think that's a really big step. I think what we saw in that video there is absolutely true, that even if we do certain scientific discoveries, they don't necessarily or automatically exclude the existence of God. There are a lot of Christians who believe in some form of evolution. And even amongst atheists, there's research been done. A lot of atheists don't believe in evolution through natural selection. So even if you believe in some form of evolutionary theory, that doesn't exclude the existence of God. So I'm not trying to prove you wrong here, even though that might look like it. What I'm mainly trying to do is, given your current framework of thinking, invite you to see that God still has a place in it. You know, God might still have a place in it. And that is really true of evolution as well. You know, what's quite funny is when Darwin wrote his first book on the book that we know on an origins of species. One of the first responses that he got was from a Christian reverend, Charles Kingsley, who complimented him on his work on his research of how God, made people, and it was so positive that Darwin even took it into account in his second edition of his book. So I think that's quite interesting, that sometimes the portrayal of Christians or the church is that we're really against science, and I think both points already show that that's not really the case. I think faith and science can really work together to answer some of the main questions that we have in life in general. And I think there's a quote by C.S. Lewis that I really like. And he says that I believe he was an atheist who became a Christian over the course of his life. He was a writer, and he wrote this. He says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." So I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, and not only because I see it, because by it I see everything else. And I think that colors our thinking, is that we see the evidence for God around us, because we believe in him, but it also really colors what we see. My third topic, third point, is what's beyond science. Beyond science. Physicists would agree that there are certain answers that you can't explain through physics. So, for example, the whole field of metaphysics goes beyond physics, so you can't use physics to explain it. And I think what we know in our society is that we can't answer every question that we have with the science. And maybe you can't answer every question with religion either, but you can't answer every question that we have that is relevant to us with science. One of the questions, or at least topics, that really triggers us is the question, the topic of suffering. And next week we'll talk about that. How do we deal with suffering? How do we deal with it from a Christian standpoint of view? How does it work with God and suffering? The fact that there is suffering, I think science cannot take that more than as a given. There's no further explanation. So I think we'll talk about that next week. So if you know someone who's really struggling with this issue, or maybe that's you, please be here next week, because I know that Pastor Steve has something amazing prepared. There are two other things that I want to discuss, and one is the issue of morality. I think science cannot answer the issue of morality. Maybe you've got kids, or maybe your friends or family have kids. And one of the things that strikes me a lot about kids is, from a very young age, they seem to know the concept of fairness. Do you know how long does it take from the moment that a child can speak until the moment that they can say, this is not fair? I think that's a really short time span, right? This is not fair is probably in the top 10 of things that they learn to say. But where does it come from? The feeling of a kid, the absolute conviction of a young one that life should be fair. Right? Who taught a kid that life should be fair? I don't think any of us, I don't know how many parents, I say us, but I'm not a parent. I don't know how many of you parents have taught your kids that life should be fair. I don't think that's in one of the top 10 things that you learn them. So it's really something that's inside them, saying life should be fair. Like there should be some system of judgment and fairness. So I think that's really interesting. That points to, I think, a morality that transcends culture. And skeptics would usually say that morality is a product of culture, but we really believe that morality transcends culture, because we believe that God made morality. He's a moral code writer. Have any of you ever cheated on a test? Well, let's be honest in church. I see a lot of hands. Did you get a good grade? I'm not saying that if you ever cheated on a test, you immediately feel like a sense of condemnation. Because I've cheated on tests as well. I don't think that's necessarily true. But have you ever worked hard for a test and gotten a good grade as well? Right? Approximately the same amount of people. I think a little bit less. The feeling that you get from working hard for a test and actually getting a good grade is really different. It's a different feeling, right? It's more of a feeling of contentment and really of achievement, which is a different feeling than just maybe the feeling of slight relief and joy that you get from cheating a test, but they're different feelings. And even though the result might be the same, the whole process says something about how we perceive it, and I think that points to a certain morality inside of us. And the last topic I want to discuss is the cause of the universe. I'm running a little bit over time. I hope you can forgive me for that. Is the topic of the cause of the universe. I think the biggest problem that naturalists or evolutionists have to explain is the cause of the universe. Some time ago, a Catholic priest and physicist, Lemaitre came with came with the hypothesis or the theory of the Big Bang, the Big Bang theory. I'm not talking about TV, I'm talking about the actual theory. And the biggest objection to this hypothesis was not from the church, as some people would expect, but was from scientists themselves. For several reasons. I think the first reason is, I think if a new evidence or a new theory comes on the market, it's good to be critical. I think that's probably the first reason. The second reason is it was really contradicting the current teaching. Their current teaching at the time was the universe is eternal. The amount of energy in the universe stays constant. And the third reason why the scientific community objected initially, not anymore, but initially to this theory of the Big Bang is that it looked awfully like the Judeo-Christian worldview that there is a beginning, which is weird, right? That is actually an objection. So this theory says that all of the universe, it's not eternal. The energy in it is not constant, but you can all bring it back to one point. You can trace what happened in the universe, you can trace it back to one point and say that's the beginning. But if you can do that, that brings more questions. If you'd say that the universe is constant, it's equal, it doesn't change, and maybe you can even say that everything in the universe is created by the universe itself, that's something completely different. That sort of says that everything is self-explanatory. But if you say that everything stems back to one point, then you would probably say, okay, but why did it begin? How does that work? And maybe even most importantly, who then started it? What started it, right? If it started in some point, it makes a lot of sense to ask the question of what caused it then. And we believe that it's God in this church. We believe that God at one point started the universe. I used to love CSI. Did you ever watch CSI? Crime Scene Investigation, right? I used to watch it, and I loved how every episode started approximately the same. There was a murder committed, and there was a team of detectives and scientists who would figure out what happened. They would maybe in some ways reconstruct what had happened, and that would tell them a lot. That would tell them when it happened. That would tell them how it happened, and that it would tell them what happened exactly. And I think that's a bit similar with how science works. It can tell us so much about how the world works. Listen, I think everyone here is thankful and appreciative of developments in science. I mean, the way we can live now is due to developments we've made in science. The reason that we can save so many people in the field of healthcare is because of scientific developments. We're not people who are against science, okay? I'm thankful for all the developments. But if you go back to that scene in CSI, the scientist, who did all the investigations, usually with the bugs and seeing how far developed the larvae are, he could tell how and what. But there's one thing. Sometimes the evidence would even point to a who. Sometimes, but what it doesn't, the answer that the reconstruction never answers is why. Right? Science never tells you why. And if we look at this painting, Pastor Steve painted it. It might look a bit chaotic. It might look like it has no order. And it might look like he just took a couple of tubes of paint and threw them on there, which in some ways he did. Like, it's still splash paint. But if you look a little bit closer, you can see that he thought of like foundations. There's a background color. He thought about, which colors should I use? He thought about, what is the distance that I need to splash my paint from? Do I splash it from here? Do I splash it from here? How do the colors mix? Which color should go first? How can I create certain layers? There's a lot of thought behind, even though you might not see it at first. But if you stop and look, you'd see that there's a lot of thought behind it. And I think the same applies to our universe. If you look around, the world is crazy sometimes. I can fully understand why people would say that it's chaos and that they see no order. But if you look closely, there's an order, there's a structure that I believe is design. I believe it's just so much more than chance. I believe it's so much more. So what I would want to do right now is that we all close our eyes. And maybe you've never done that. Maybe you're not used to coming to church, and it's just a little bit weird that we all